Thanks, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Alyssa Layton, and today we are very fortunate to have Sherry Brown with us. Many of you already know Sherry. She is a member of On Kollel and has led discussion groups during high holidays for many years. Sherry is the founder and CEO of the National Coalition Building Institute. It is an international nonprofit leadership development network dedicated to the elimination of racism and other forms of oppression. It is one of the leading diversity training and grassroots leadership organizations worldwide. Leaders trained by NCBI help their communities and organizations to combat racism and all other forms of prejudice and discrimination, and to make differences among groups a community asset, and to take principled and courageous stands, especially under challenging circumstances. Today's workshop is about ending racism and learning to be effective allies. I just want to add that we extended this invitation to Sherry last year before the election. We knew then how important this work would be, but little did we know just how vital it was going to be in 2017. It's tragic that after the election and the events of this last week that this workshop is needed now more than ever. Thank you so much for being here, Sherry.
Thank you. Yeah. It's one of the things I've learned over NCBI. My organization is 33 years old, and we train trainers all over the world. And one of the things I've learned, and I teach trainers, is if you have expectation, people will respond. So I'm thrilled to be here this morning as a sister community, the community I belong to with David. And this is going to be a combination. I'm going to share some theory interspersed with us doing some things together. So it will be a combination of my talking some and us doing some activities together. And I first just want, in terms of who's here, because the work on racism, it's important to be able to identify who we are in terms of racialized identities. So let me just first ask, how many people identify as white Ashkenazi Jews? How many people identify as Sephardi Jews? Yay, George. How many people identify as having Mizrahim, Jews from Arab countries? Anyone identify as a Jew of color? And how many identify as non-Jews?
Well, I am, though.
I'm sorry?
I am.
Yeah, so how many identify? That's, yeah, you get to claim. Identity is an interesting piece, which we're going to do some work on.
Sure. Let me just say, as a geneticist, no matter what people identify with, they probably have genes or
Absolutely.
from many.
Absolutely. I don't know if folks have done, I did I'm 98% Ashkenazi Jewish. My mother's roots come from Yemenite Jews, and I have loved Yemenite dance all my life. And when I found out that, I thought, okay, it's there somewhere. So I want to say, I'm going to first start with two basic principles for us in doing work around racism. And then we're going to do the first activity. So the first thing I want to say is that in terms of doing work on racism, we need to think about showing up proudly with ourselves and who we are and our own identities. And as Jews or as non-Jews, whichever identities we belong to, we have to show up in partnership. It is, anything else is paternalism. Paternalism is, I'm here to help you because you need help. And there is a history of Jews doing anti-racism work from a paternalistic place. And I want to start that that's not the spirit we want to do the work. And I'll share with you a story. When I was 10, I wrote all these compositions dealing with racism. And one of them was titled Society's Child, Yes I Can. And it was comparing racism in South Africa and racism in the US. One was off an assignment. The teacher asked us if you were invisible and to say what you would do. And so my composition was, if I was invisible, I would want to be inside of someone who had black skin so I would understand what it was like. So this was a set of compositions. I hadn't read them in decades. I kept them. And one day, a bunch of years ago, I was with a bunch of the Black African heritage leaders in my organization. They were staying at my house. We were hanging out, and I thought, I'm going to pull out these compositions that I wrote when I was 10 years old. And I remember thinking I was so full of myself, I was going to show what a great ally as a 10-year-old I was. And I start reading them out loud to my black sisters who I had known and loved and worked with now for decades. And this was from the 50s, so it was the term the Negro. And it was dripping with the heart passion of this 10-year-old and total ignorance. And it was very much in the spirit of these poor people that were so downtrodden. And I realized as I was reading it that one, this is what I had learned, and two, what little understanding I actually had. And I share that story because I think that energy of we are here to help from that spirit of paternalism. So the first step in doing anti-racism work is we get to show up with ourselves, who we are, and also with expectation. The same expectation that I had that you would move forward in those chairs. We get to show up. So that's the first. And the second, which may be, and I will take time for questions or comments. And the second, which is not an easy one. And I want to say throughout what we're doing this morning is some of the things I'm going to say or have us do might seem easy, and hopefully some of them will not, because the work we get to do is to keep challenging ourselves. So the second principle is we want to be very thoughtful about how we look at, there's the good white people and the racist, not good white people. We're the good people, and then there's everybody else. And this is very important in terms of doing anti-racism work. The idea that some people are expendable. And we as Jews, coming from a history of where we were made expendable, need to be really aware around this piece. I always like to think of the Niemeyer quote, which in this historic moment is so profound for all of us. First they came for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the gay folks, then they came for the Jews. By the time they came for me, there was nobody left. So if we start picking people off, who are the good ones and who are not, we can't do anti-racism work from that spirit. And I will share a story about this that really called me to courage. And this was a couple of years ago. Some of you may remember. There was the owner of, I think it was a basketball team in California, Sterling. People remember that story? He was in private with someone, said some crappy racist things. And they were crappy racist things. And someone taped him, someone that wanted to get at him, taped him, unbeknownst to him, and then it got spread virally, and it was this, and he got the team taken away. He got voted out of whatever the association of basketball teams is. Well, Sterling is a raised, poor Jewish guy from Brooklyn, working class Jewish guy. And I grew up with a working class Jewish father, so I felt, I remember at the time reading all this, and it's that idea that, and again, it isn't that we don't want to take on the racism. It's that he becomes the symbol of the awful and bad. So I happened to be in a meeting of about 20 anti-racism activists and key folks from around the country who do anti-racism work. I would say probably about 17 of them were people of color, 3 of them were white, and all 3 of the white folks were Jews. And one of them I knew, and I could tell he was wildly uncomfortable with how visible I am as a proud Jewish person. And in the introductions to the meeting, each of us had to say why we do anti-racism work, what motivates us. And I spoke about growing up Jewish and tikkun olam and repairing the universe, and this is part of my tradition, and that's why I do anti-racism work. And I could tell he was sitting there squirming. I just looked over at him. So we had a day of meetings, and folks went out to dinner, and I happened to have a meeting that night and couldn't go to the dinner. And we get together the next morning, and folks are schmoozing before we start the meeting. And he and the other white Jewish person said, and I quote, "Oh, last night we unjewed Sterling." Unjewed Sterling. You know, in other words, he's not part of us. We would never be like that. And I remember I was like, my heart started beating. And I thought, these are my anti-racism colleagues from all over the country. Am I gonna say something? And all I thought was, Sherry, if you go home and don't say anything, you'll hate yourself. So I pulled together my courage and I said, I still claim him. He's part of my Jewish people. And the room got really quiet, and a bunch of folks came up to me after a bunch of the people of color came up to me and said, we were really uncomfortable and we didn't know what to do. And I tell you that as a second principle because it's really important in doing anti-racism work that we don't make, and we're seeing so much in this period, the us's and the them's, and what happened when it was made the us's and the them's in terms of the election. And it isn't that we don't want to take on the racism, but we have to do it from the spirit of we're all in this together. And I will tell you one last piece, and then I'm going to demonstrate our first activity together. This is similar to all the issues around Israel and racism. And I've been doing Middle East peace work since 1967. So I have seen and helped build most of the organizations in the US that do that work. And I've seen so much around all of that issue. And it's the same principle, which is we get to take accountability for the racism that is being perpetrated against Palestinian people. And at the same time, we don't get to push Israel away. That is the history of our people, is to be made expendable. So the first principle is we get to show up as ourselves, as Jews, as non-Jews, in all of our identities. The second principle is we don't make anyone expendable in doing this work. So that's the foundation I want to start with. So we're going to do our first activity, and George, and this is my husband George, he's just going to basically be a standing place I'm going to model what I want you to do, and throughout we're going to be doing a number of activities in pairs. And each time I say pair, I find a different person, maybe someone you don't know so well in the Kehila, so you can keep connecting to each other. And what I'm going to invite you to do is first, and let me just, is you're going to name identities. You're going to name identities that are important to you when you think about who you are. Who do you show up with when you think about doing anti-racism work? What are the key identities for you? Then you're going to pick one and say a strength that you get from that identity that helps you to do anti-racism work. And then you're going to say a struggle as a result of mistreatment, oppression, misunderstandings to that group that makes it hard to do anti-racism work. and I'm going to model for you. So, hi, George.
How do you do?
So the groups that I identify with is I'm Jewish, I'm female, raised working class, daughter of small shopkeeper. I'm Midwestern, I'm from the Midwest. I'm white, I'm a USer from the United States. I'm a strong political activist, and I'm in a committed relationship with someone who's Catholic. So that's your first task. You're going to name some of the key identities that you belong to. And I will say that this is a really fundamental part of this work. I should also say to you that I began to do this particular workshop in the way that I'm doing it for a bunch of years now. I've been asked to work with different young adult Jewish organizations, the Jeremiah Project, Avodah, Jews United for Justice, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, who asked me to come in and work with them on racism. And I kept noticing that the young adult Jews I was working with were doing all this anti-racism work, but they didn't understand themselves as Jews, and they didn't understand what they were bringing to the partnership. And so that's why I'm starting us with your identities first. So first task is to list a bunch of the identities that you belong to, that when you think about doing anti-racism work, you show up in that identity. Then the second question is to pick one. What's a primary identity for you? That when you're doing anti-racism work, that's kind of who you are. And so I'm going to pick being Jewish. And then you're going to say a strength you get from that helps you in your anti-racism work. And then you're going to say a struggle or a challenge in doing anti-racism work. So I'm Jewish, and the strength I get is I feel like as long as there's breath in me, I'm going to be an activist. And I really felt it in this last couple weeks, that when everyone's discouraged around me, I'm just like, bring it on. I'm like, bring it on! You know, you're going to get awful, we're going to get stronger. And I feel like, and I'll say raised working class Jewish. And I feel like that spirit that I got from my dad of you just, and it's not just keep going, but you keep going, you know, and you just hold on to hope. And I feel like that I bring. So that's the strength I have. And the struggle I have is that, in my experience, people are clueless about anti-Semitism. And even with all the anti-Semitism in the campaign, I think people have very little clue. So when I show up to do anti-racism work, that's a battle. That I feel like there's so much cluelessness and invisibility about anti-Semitism. So that's your task. First, you're going to say key groups you belong to that you think are important to your identity. Then you're going to pick the key one. And what's a strength you get from that helps you in anti-racism work? And what's a struggle that you have that you're up against in doing anti-racism work coming from that group? So stand up, find a partner to do this with. So the next piece is that we carry bias. You know, and you did a beautiful job of modeling that, and it is not just you, growing up in Brooklyn, whatever age you were. It is all of us. We have folks that come to NCBI all the time and say things like, I don't have a racist bone in my body. How many of us have heard someone say that? Well, guess what? What do we think? What are they really saying? They're really trying to say, I'm a good person. I'm really a good person. So I'm going to say to each and every one of you, you're a good person. You are a good person, and so is everyone else in this room, and so is everyone else. I often like to say, people do not wake up in the morning saying, I can't wait to be a racist today. That's my goal. If you're not sure about that, think of a baby. You know, when you look at an infant, you think innocence. We are all innocent. And the phrase I like to use is, we want to have deep generosity with ourselves and each other, while at the same time accountability. I was thinking as I was preparing this morning of, you know, of David's teaching to us at Yom Kippur. And what has David taught us when we go like this? What has David taught us? We're knocking on our hearts, exactly. And that, I'm sure many of you grew up like I and David and many of us did, for the sin against this and for the sin against that. And it's, no. It's, beloved heart, open up. That's what the spirit of anti-racism work. It is teshuva work. It is exactly teshuva work. It is what we do during the Yamim Noraim and Yom Kippur, is we are opening our hearts to see what's there and release. So I start out saying we're all good people. We do not intend to be racist. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we all grew up in this society. And in the same way that every man has sexist conditioning, every Gentile has anti-Semitic conditioning, every heterosexual person has gay conditioning, anti-gay conditioning, every white person has racist conditioning. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It means through growing up, the stuff seeps in. And what politicians can do is they can use it. And we're seeing that everywhere. The conditioning is there. The seeds are there. And in the current research that's being done now, the terminology that's being used is unconscious bias. In particular, my organization has a huge project that we bring police and community leaders together to do work on racism. And that concept of unconscious bias means it's not that you're consciously walking around. You might, there are people that consciously walk around and think racist thoughts, but for the most part, the stuff is there. We get it in movies, we get it in books, we get it in our neighborhoods, in our institutions. And I'll share with you an example from me, and then I'm going to demonstrate for you the exercise I want us to do. A bunch of years ago, there was a leader in my organization. He is Puerto Rican heritage, and as I mentioned earlier, we train trainers all over the world to do work in schools and in communities, on college campuses, and he wanted to lead a train-the-trainer program. And in my mind, I thought he wasn't ready. And he would come to me and I'd say, "You're not ready." And he'd come to me again. And after he bugged me like the third time, I thought, all right, this is ridiculous. I said, "I'll tell you what, let's go train together. And I'll get to witness." And we trained together, and he was a brilliant trainer. He now is he leads we have a black woman who was the former chief of the sheriff's department in Seattle, and they partner. He's a Latino man, and she's an African heritage woman in police, and they do our law enforcement program together. He's a brilliant trainer. But I had to train with him and afterwards I had to face the unbearable feeling and realization that I had racism. And I wasn't walking around thinking, Puerto Rican men, they're not smart enough. If I'd been thinking that, I would have had a whole different set of things. I would have worked on it a lot earlier. I was just thinking, he's not ready. And I had to face that I had unconscious racist conditioning. We all have it. It's not our fault, but it is our accountability. And that's why I say it's the same spirit for me of Yom Kippur. It is not our fault, but it is our responsibility and accountability to get rid of it. So I'm going to demonstrate for you, and I'm going to ask George again. And because we're working on racism, what I'm going to ask you to do, find a new partner, and I want you to pick a racial group that neither of you are a member of. Okay, and you have many choices. I'm going to demonstrate with George, and we're going to do two terms because the unconscious bias gets attached to the term itself. And that's why as groups claim pride in their own identities, terms change. The word Hispanic, for example, was a government term given. And so the term Latino and Latina, and there are increasingly additional words. If you decide you want to do Black, I would encourage you to do African American, Black, depending on your age, Negro, If you try black women, black men, you'll get very different words. And this, what we're going to be looking at, and I don't know, but I still have my first record player I ever got when I was a teenager, and those records. The concept of a record means it doesn't change. If you what's the kind of music someone likes? Jazz. What's a jazz musician you like?
Pat Metheny.
Pat Metheny. So if you were listening to a record of Pat Metheny, you're not going to hear Beethoven.
That's right.
You're going to hear Pat Metheny every time you put on that record. We have records inside about groups other than our own. The records don't change. We change. And we have more and more ability to not put the needle on. Once the needle's on, that record's going around, and the same things are playing in your head. So what this exercise is to get out with some of those records through no fault of our own that we've internalized. So George and I are going to work around, and we're going to use two terms. We're going to use Native American, and we're going to use the term Indian. And the term Indian, both as children, that was the term, and Native peoples in the US more and more are wanting the term Indian. So we're going to do both terms. And I'm going to say the word Native American interspersed with Indian several times to George, and we're not going to have a conversation. We're not going to say our personal experience. I'm going to ask him to say the first uncensored word that pops into his head, because that's what gets at the records. And that's why I want you to work on a group that neither of you belong to. So again, if you do black, try black, African American, black women, black men. If you try Hispanic, Latino, also try a few nationalities, Mexican, Puerto Rican, because you'll get very different words. So it'll look like this. You ready? Native American.
Marina.
Indian.
Beads.
Native American.
Teepees.
Indian.
Can you talk louder?
Indian.
Teepees, I said. Indian. Poverty.
Okay, and then the same thing back with me.
Native American.
Go. Whoa.
Indians.
Native ceremonies.
Native Americans.
Lazy. And it was interesting. That was and you'll notice as you're doing it, if you feel like, ouch, this stuff hurts. It hurts to have it. We always say it's not just a hurt to the target groups. It hurts all of us to have this misinformation. But we can't move on it if we don't get it out there. So I'm going to invite you again to find a partner, pick a racialized group that neither of you belong to, and do just what, and try a couple different terms, and your partner will just say the term a couple times, and it's the first uncensored word that pops into your head. So find a partner. You found yourself censoring, being surprised by what you came up with, thinking, I can't believe I thought that. Did anybody find yourself freezing? Your partner said a term and you just froze for a second. There was no word. Well, the way our brains work, if I said a word, you'd have a word. We freeze and say, I don't want to know what's there. I don't want something to spit out of my mouth that's going to identify me as a bigot. So before we hear what you came up with, I want to introduce an additional piece. Can I ask the folks in the back just to move up just a little bit? It just helps to keep a sense of community for the workshop. They're doing great. They're doing great. So,
Knitters.
what?
They're all knitting back there.
They're fine. They're all fine. Just ask them to move a little closer. Yeah. You can do anti-racism work while knitting. I want to teach another principle before we hear what you came up with in your pairs. And that is being able to take risks and make mistakes. There's no way to do anti-racism, anti-oppression work without taking risks, without making mistakes. I often like to say evolution are the mistakes that turn out more pro-survival, right? And yet we learn early in life, you don't get good grades on tests for making a lot of mistakes. So we learn early on not to make mistakes, and yet we have to take risks to do this work. So I want to introduce a skill. So everybody open your arms wide. I want you to turn to the person next to you, and I want you to try this phrase. I love taking risks. I love making mistakes. How many of you believed it? So there's a second part. It's the reason we don't like taking risks and we don't like making mistakes. It's what happens to us. That's not the way I say my name. I can't believe you asked me that stupid question. So the second part, open your arms again. And this time I want you to try the phrase, I welcome you to take a risk or make a mistake about me. I will tell you a quick story about this, and then I'm going to hear what you came up with in your pairs. It was a bunch of years ago, and I was leading an NCBI workshop at Eastern Mennonite College, which is a predominantly Mennonite school. And I've been leading the workshop for half the day, and my colleague who had brought me in, who's Mennonite, was standing by my side, and one of the young students came up to me and said, I just want you to know that all morning I kept thinking that you're Jewish and I couldn't learn from you at all. And then I decided you're just like Jesus, so it was okay. And my colleague was horrified, like, saying this to this Jewish woman, like, no! And so I decided to play with it, and that afternoon I started skipping in, when he was right there and singing Jesus Loves Me, Yes I Know. And I was playing with it. People are gonna make we're gonna make a lot of mistakes doing this work, and we have to be able to welcome each other around it. So,
you gotta kiss a lot of frogs.
well said. So now that we're willing to take a risk, say the words we came up with, we're willing to be generous to each other. We're ready to hear. So what group did you do, and what were some of the words you said? Let's hear from a couple folks. In working with Jews all over the world on this, is that even if we might think logically that Arabs are good people, we have been so terrorized, particularly as Jews, and have those intense recordings that make it very hard to build long-term. One of the things I learned in that group was I've built long-term relationships with African American, Asian, Latino, Native peoples. I have friendships with Palestinians. It's been much harder to build long-term sustained without working a lot on those records. So thank you for the courage to put them out. Somebody else, what was the group? Formally, when I lead workshops, and I tend to ask people to only work around groups that we have in the room, and then we get a chance to hear what it's like to hear those from those folks. But because we are not wildly a racialized group, and I wanted us to get a chance, I didn't do it that way here. But I do want to say, one of the things that we went through in the election was all of these attitudes, particularly about working class folks. And we are reaping some of the horrible results of these attitudes. So doing this work is absolutely critical to move forward. And I like to acknowledge us for having the courage to do this work. So turn to the person next to you and say, you're doing a great job, keep up the good work.
Before you go on.
Yes.
I asked you about one of the things you said that we want to hope that everybody is good.
Yes, I did.
Have you ever worked, this will be my own turn, have you ever worked with KKK groups?
I sure have.
What
I've
have you
worked
done?
with Klan, I've worked with ex-Nazis, children of ex-Nazis at concentration camps in Germany. I worked with the Klan. I will tell you a quick story, and then I'm going to go on to the next piece. This was a campus on the east coast of the U.S., and there had been ugly racist flyers on doors, and the president of the school decided they needed to do something, and they canceled all the classes. I had 1,000 students in a room. And one of the pieces that we were going to do, that I did in that workshop, I wasn't planning to do it just because of time this morning, is that one of the things I teach is that where we feel ashamed of ourselves, we're not good allies. And one of the ways I like to talk about this is, imagine if you had a fire. Would you want the person showing up at that fire saying, I'm not a great firefighter, my people are not great firefighters, but I'll do the best I can? I don't think so. You want the person, I'm a great firefighter, I come from a line of great firefighters, I'm just the person to put out this fire. And we have a lot of fires going on right now. So if we walk around, and there's another phrase we use at NCBI, guilt is the glue that holds prejudice in place. I'm going to say that again. Guilt is the glue that holds prejudice in place. The more you target someone, the more you point a finger at him, and you have a lot of racism, you really better work on it. You have a lot of sexism, you better look at it. You get defensiveness. You get defensiveness. You get defensiveness, and that's not a useful spot. When someone's defended, they're not available. A bunch of years ago, and folks may remember the Rodney King incident. It was a forerunner to Ferguson, and Rodney King incident had just happened, and right after it, I was doing a training session for the entire Los Angeles Police Department. Well, they'd been so targeted by all the media around their, we're not racist, we're not racist, we're not racist. I mean, they were so defended because they'd been so attacked. So one of the skills I teach, and this is a story to get to your question, one of the skills that we teach in NCBI is that where we feel ashamed about ourselves, we're not good allies. So we have, and I usually try to have someone demonstrate that skill. I pick a group that people think they are racist a lot. And so I brought up someone in that 1,000-person workshop who got to leap in the air and say, it's great to be a white man. And everyone applauded him. Because we can and hopefully will end all racism, and there will still be males and females and other gendered peoples. We can and hopefully will end racism, and there will still be white people. It's not genetic. It's not inherent. And the more you feel good about yourself, the less you're going to be racist. So to go back to your question, workshop finished. The next day, I called the dean to check in. And she said, we're pretty sure we know the student who was plastering racist flyers all over the campus. But because we couldn't catch him in that moment, we couldn't prosecute. That student came to her office and said, if white men can be applauded, I want to lead this work. And he became one of the fiercest allies doing anti-racism work. And I have worked with some pretty horrific behaviored people. So I'll say horrific behaviored people, and seen incredible changes. But you have to start with the principle that where people feel bad about, it's like where people feel bad about themselves, the way I like to say is there's the holes inside. And again, that's what a politician is good at, that we're witnessing, is they manipulate people in those spots. So if we're serious about ending people's, the perpetrator stuff, what we'll do is help them feel better about themselves. So what I want to do is I want to do a next piece, and for this, I am speaking particularly to all of us as Jews in the room. It's a piece of theory. I've been leading workshops for blacks and Jews with a colleague of mine for the last 20 years, and this theory we developed together, so I want her name in the room because we've partnered around it. Her name is Barbara Love. She's retired, but she was a former professor at Smith College in Amherst. And it's what I call the hook. The hook is where anti-Semitism and racism hook. And I want to teach this because I think it's really important for us as Jews when we think about doing partnered work with people of color, people of racialized identities. And this piece of theory is specifically for white Ashkenazi Jews. I mean, many Jews are Jews of color, and then it's a little different. So The circle starts up here. And one of the ways I've been talking about us as white Ashkenazi Jews in this last couple of years is that we are scared active. I'm going to say that again. We are scared active. And what that means is, I often like to say when white, particularly white middle-class Gentiles are scared, they might hide out in their bedrooms. When Jews are scared, we build 10 new organizations. And we're seeing this now a lot. I've been really trying to slow everyone down, I know. This stuff's going to be there for another couple days. We need to heal how terrified we are. Why? Because if you're scared active, you've got the action here, but underneath it is terror. And when you are acting out of terror, it's not always logical, well thought out. And we need logical, well thought out action. So we, and I say my beloved people, we are scared active out of a history of horrible oppression. We didn't choose it. And until we heal the terror, some of our actions are fueled by terror. So we're scared active, and some of the behaviors when we're scared active is we sometimes interrupt. How many of you ever have trouble not interrupting? I do. We interrupt. We sometimes need to be in control. Who's ever noticed that about yourself and others? We need to be in charge. We need to be in control. We sometimes take over a little bit. We're not bad. This is our oppression. It's like there's a fire underneath us, propelling us into action to try to become secure. One of the stories I often share with my beloved dad of blessed memory, when he was a wonderful, wonderful, terrified Jewish man. And when he was in a car, he needed to be driving the car. In that sense, he had to be in charge. Well, my younger brother, this was many years ago, was getting married, and my dad had broken his arm that week, so he couldn't drive the car to the wedding. So I was driving the car. I'm sure he was nervous and anxious, so he started doing what my dad does when he's nervous and anxious. You're not driving far enough to the right of the road. He was sitting up front. I looked in the back mirror. My mom was in the back going, oh no, he's going to ruin the whole day. And I was so happy. My brother was getting married. It was a joyous day. And I'm like, you're right, Daddy. I'm not driving far enough to the right. And he started to laugh. And that was it. It released it. I got him laughing so he could release his anxiety. And we had a great wedding day. And I share that story because I think that's not untypical of the needing to be in charge as a way of creating safety. It's all about safety. So we, scared active, we sometimes interrupt, we maybe take over, we want to be in charge. It feels like if another aspect of it is everything isn't correct, danger is going to happen. Things feel dangerous quickly, so we need to correct things. We might do that with everybody, because that's how we sometimes live life in that spot of Jewish terror, scared active. When we do that with a person of color, guess what? It's racism. It's racism. If you do that, if you're partnered or doing something or in relationship with a person of color, a black person, an Asian person, a Latino person, a Native person, and you keep interrupting or take over or need to be the one in charge. And we see this in organizational work all the time. I led an evening for all the rabbis of Philadelphia Tuesday night. And one of the rabbis came up to me, and she's part of a Power and Light climate change Jewish multi-faith group in Philadelphia. And she was talking about, and I was just listening to her, and I could just think, and it was like, bless her heart. She cared so passionately about these issues, but it was very much so, we're taking over. You could feel her anxiety and her nervousness. And again, when we do that around people of color, it becomes racist. Then And sometimes it hooks their internalized racism, where they're feeling bad about themselves. And then they get mad, and what comes at us is anti-Semitism. And that makes us even more scared active, and the cycle continues. I'll give you 2 examples. I'm going to give you a personal one from my life, and I'm going to give you a political one around Black Lives Matter. And then I'm going to send you into a pair to think of where this resonates. It could be a personal one in your life, or if you can't think of a personal one, maybe a political one. So the personal one is the person she's an African heritage woman, and I've been working with her for 28 years. She and I have led workshops, probably 500 workshops all over the world. I feel it's like a marriage. You love each other, you drive each other crazy, and so I was with her recently, and she had just had surgery, major surgery on her back. So she was still overcoming the anesthesia, and we were trying to work together about some work for our organization, and she would say something and I would get excited and I'd interrupt her. And normally she doesn't like it, but because she had just had surgery and had anesthesia, she really was having trouble holding on to her. I'd interrupt her and then she would completely lose her thought. And then so it cooked where and racism internalized I've watched her for years battle for her mind. I mean, she is one of the most brilliant. I've learned so much from her about racism. She's one of the most brilliant women I know, and I've watched her have to battle for her mind because she cares. I have the internalized Jewish oppression of the world's not safe, and she has the internalized racism of, am I smart enough? And so she would start screaming at me. And if you scream, it's like it didn't, and I kept doing it. It was like you'd think she'd scream at me, I'd stop. It was like the more she screamed at me, it was like I kept feeling scared active. And so we cycled. I mean, we did talk about it and work it through, and that's part of our relationship of we do work on stuff a lot together. But I wanted to show you this dynamic because it's very important to trying to think about doing anti-racism work. So that's a personal story. The political one, who's read the platform from Black Lives, the Black Lives platform? If you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend it. It is one of the most important documents. It's very profound prescription for what needs to happen to end certainly racism towards Black African heritage people in the U.S. And I don't know if folks are familiar with what happened around the platform, but one of the things, the week the platform came out, there is a one-page statement, which actually a Jewish woman wrote, and from my perspective had a fair chunk of internalized oppression. But one of the things it was a one-page thing about Israel. Now, why is a page about Israel in the Black Lives Matter platform? Interesting question. And so what it said was that Israel perpetrated genocide. Israel was an apartheid state and perpetrated genocide. Well, all hell broke loose in the Jewish world that week. And you had basically 3 kinds of responses. You had Jewish Community Relations Council of Boston that said, we're gonna have nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. This was horrible, anti-Semitic, awful. We will have nothing to do with them. You had groups like Truach, which is the group of rabbis doing social justice work that said, we're committed to working with Black Lives Matter, and we're going to dialogue with them about why calling what Israel is doing with Palestinians genocide is not exactly accurate. Then you had a group, Jewish Voice for Peace, say, we love the statement. It was perfect just the way it is. And those 3 responses is kind of where our community is. We'll have nothing to do with you because you're horribly anti-Semitic. Everything you said is perfect, including that Israel is perpetrating genocide. Or we care deeply about the issues, we want to partner together and teach each other. I actually wrote Michael Lerner had asked me to write a blog for Tikkun right after when all that was flying. And one of the things I wrote was, because I went, first I looked up the word genocide. I wanted to see what's the definition of genocide, and is what's happening, and is there a way we could? And what I wrote was, I think it's the wrong battle. To get into this huge, I mean, what is happening to Palestinians is awful, awful. However, to tell a Jewish people that has had genocide perpetrated against them, this is genocide, is so painful. And then to get into these big debates, is it genocide, is it not? Is it genocide, is it not? And what was happening was nobody was reading the platform. Nobody was committed to the work on racism. Blacks and Jews were fighting it out. And this is a core piece of what happens where Jews get scared active, they perpetrate racism, they get screamed at, it's anti-Semitism. This whole cycle goes round and round, the work never gets done. I'll give you two other quick examples, and then I want to give you a moment to think of something for yourself. I was at the UN Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, and one of the things I often do with Jews when I want them to understand anti-Semitism is I help them think of what's their aha moment. Durban was my aha moment. It was the most painful place I'd ever been. There were people wearing big buttons saying Hitler didn't do enough of his job. The Protocols of Zion were on tables all over the conference. The head of the conference, Mary Robinson, who was former Prime Minister of Ireland, Irish Catholic woman, was shown caricatures that were being passed around the conference with a hook-nosed caricature with blood dripping down. It was the beginnings of all of the relating that Israel is like South Africa at that UN meeting. And Mary Robinson was shown these pictures, and she was alleged to have said, "This is being passed around the conference, I'm a Jew." The next day, the newspapers said, "Mary Robinson says I'm a Jew." The last day of the conference, there were like 20,000 anti-racism activists in the stadium. Fidel Castro was about to address the group. He talked for hours. But before he addressed the group, Mary Robinson, because she was the head of the UN meeting, the UN NGO meeting on racism, was introduced. Many people, not all, many people hissed and booed her. And I looked around that room, and it was my first aha moment. Oh my God, my people, anti-racism activists, have feelings about Jews and about Israel. But that's not where that story ends. The US pulled out. The US said it was pulling out because of anti-Semitism towards Jews and towards Israel. Right before the US pulled out, they were about to pass a resolution around reparations for descendants of slaves. The US did not want to have that resolution passed because they could be liable for reparations. So it could be, it's Jew. We're protecting Jews in Israel. So once more, blacks and Jews fighting it out. And the work on racism doesn't get done. So, and I'm telling you these stories because it's really important to understand this mechanism. And the work on Black Lives Matter and what happened in Durban is our peoples get pitted against each other in this cycle. So I'm going to invite you to find a pair, to think of either a personal example of when you were connected to, close to, working with, colleagues with, family member with, a person of color, where you either interrupted, needed to be in control in some way, something, any piece of this hook that you can relate to. So find a person to share that. Which is, I want to end the session teaching a skill. And this is the skill of what do you do when someone makes a racist comment joke, or slur, and you want to keep a good relationship and you want to try to move something. So what I'm going to do is I've asked George again, so we're going to... In NCBI, we call this the bug. The bug is, I'm going to ask him to make an oppressive comment 3 times. The bug is the bad, then the ugly, then the good. And I sometimes think it helps to see out there what's not useful first. So we're going to do this 3 times. Then I'm going to give you a moment to think of a comment, and I'm going to at least do a demonstration with someone to practice the skill that I'm teaching. Okay?
So Sherry, what's going on is just really awful. All these immigrants are coming into our country. They're taking over. It's really awful. I mean, I'm so glad that.
That's such a great sweater, George. It looks really nice on you. I really love that sweater. What's my strategy? I didn't hear you. Ignore the person. You didn't hear them. How many of us have used that strategy? I think all of us at some moment. Ignore the person, change the subject, walk away. Does that change anything? No. Here's the second strategy that's not so useful.
So Sherry, it's just so awful. All these immigrants are coming into our country. They're taking over.
Well, I can't believe you said that. Maybe you shouldn't live in this country. You don't think everybody has a right who wants to be in this country? What's your problem? What's that strategy?
Attack.
Attack. Is that very useful? And then there's what I call the white middle class version of that. That really offends me. If you tell someone something really offends you, you're still saying they're a bad person. You're just doing it much more polite. And usually, well, I would never do that. And again, I said the phrase earlier, guilt is the glue that holds prejudice in place. So if you ignore the person, it's not going to change a lot. If you attack the person, it's not going to change a lot. So now we're going to look at what's a useful skill.
So Sherry, these immigrants are coming into the country. They're taking over. It's really awful. I'm so glad that someone's finally taking charge and doing something about this. It's about time.
George, has something specific happened to you around immigrants?
Well, I just think of all the people, who are losing their jobs, and I'm really worried about them. And I know at least some people that I know that are really struggling.
And what's it like? What have you noticed about those people that are struggling?
That it's really hard to see that people are unemployed, and I wanted to do something for them.
So what happened in that third time that did not happen when I ignored him or attacked him? I listened to him, so what was my tone? So I was calm, I was caring, I did listen. Did you notice, what happened for George? It started personal. He shared a personal story. He got, rather than being up here, and we also started talking to each other. We made actual real contact. The question helped to decrease defensiveness. What question did I ask him?
How's it affected?
I said, did something personal happen to you? Remember I said earlier, we don't change people's minds, we change their, and what changes hearts is, you need that person to tell a story. And the third, so tone, asking questions to decrease defensiveness. The third concept is, well, I say you can't have 2 ouches at the same moment. What does that mean? Imagine if I had a pain in my arm and I went to the doctor and I said, let me tell you about the pain in my arm. And the doctor said, yeah, let me tell you about the pain in my leg. That sounds ludicrous, right? We wouldn't stay very long with that doctor. But that's what's happening so much. You tell someone, you really upset me. Yeah, I'm going to tell you what you just did. And you go like that. So someone has to, in the language we use in NCBI, has to put their ouch in the parking lot. Now, if you put your car in the parking lot, as long as you remember where it is, you can still get it, right? Which means it's not that you never have any feelings, you never get to say what's concerning you, But someone is going to have to park their car in the parking lot. They're out in the parking lot first and listen to this person. The other way to think about this is, if you have a cup and it's completely full, what do you have to do first? Before anything new can go in that cup. You have to drink it or pour it out. You have to drain that cup, whether you drink it or pour it out, for something new. And we keep pouring new information in. We want this person to understand more how we see things. And they're full. We got a whole country of people with their cups very, very full. And there's no place, I'll get to in one sec. There's no place for new information. The way to think about this is the bigotry sits up here, and underneath someone is saying, ouch. What most of us do is we try to attack the bigotry. We don't get to the ouch underneath. It has to go somewhere. So the skill we're going to look at is how do you help, so using tone, asking questions to decrease defensiveness, putting our ouch in the parking lot, to listen, and listening is a revolutionary tool. Listening is a profound, revolutionary tool. It is the best tool we have to shift people. And there's obviously a lot more that we could teach on this. I will end the session with a story about this skill. And I said listening is a profound, revolutionary tool. And in my life and work, I have seen amazing things, even in moments when I thought nothing can happen to change here. And a real turning point moment for me, this was right before I moved to DC, and I moved down here in '91, just when David was starting on Kollel, so I'm one of the very early members. I was leading a workshop in Boston where I lived at the time, and there were about 500 people in the room, and I was leading the workshop with an Arab man. His name was Yassine, and we were trying to model being a Jew and an Arab for each other's peoples. And I had just gotten back from Israel, and so I was just filled with pride and love for Israel. And at some point in my presentation, I said something about being proud of Israel. I never finished my presentation. There was a Palestinian woman in the room. Her name was Najwa. I'd never met her before. She was 500 people was a large. She was way in the back of the room. Najwa, it turns out, had come to the US. This was when Israel had been bombing in southern Lebanon. And Najwa had been working as a nurse in the PLO camps in southern Lebanon, and her ears had been impaired as a result of Israel's bombings in Lebanon. And Najwa stands up in the back of the room and starts screaming at me, "How could you be proud of Israel?" And she's screaming and screaming. My stomach clutched. And I remember in my head, it was like, oh my God. Some of the things she said I agreed with. Some of the things she said I did not. And I was like, oh my God, 500 people are listening to this diatribe about Israel. But it's like, I get sometimes these moments and I literally hear this voice, you've got to listen to her. You've got to listen to her. Just trust what you know, trust what you know. And I was ready to throw up. I was so scared. And she's screaming and screaming at me, and I did not interrupt her. I think she screamed at me for 15 minutes, and the room was like, you could feel the terror in the room. It was a mixed group of Jews and Arabs and other folks, and you could just feel the vibration. She finished 15 minutes of screaming at me about Israel. And she looked up at me from the back of the room and said, "You're the first Jewish person who's ever listened to me. Can we meet for lunch?" That room, it's like I didn't have to do anything else. Najwa and I, she was in the US for another 3 months to continue to get surgery for her ears. We met, we started out on Satan, we talked about Arab men and Jewish men and our relationship. We made a connection as sisters. And then as we got to know each other, we began to talk about the conflict. Najwa and I led one of the very early workshops for members of the Israeli Knesset and the PLO when it was still illegal for them to meet. So there was that one moment when, and I tell you, I did not think that tool would work in a room with 500 people listening, and I just thought, but some voice in me said, Sherry, you've got to model listening to her, whatever it's going to take you to do it. And it was a turning point moment for me in my understanding the profoundness of these tools, and that, you know, you don't always have a miraculous moment because people's ouches can be pretty deep. But I do know it is the only tool that turns things. And we have to get more and more practice in them. So I know it's time to end, and I want to honor time commitments. I will just end and say that I did, if you are interested, I brought 2 things. This is about my organization, NCBI, and I also brought 3 times a year we do open trainings. They're 3.5 days, and they're held in Hunt Valley, Maryland, so they're not far. And they're at the end of April, in early August, and in early November, either for yourself, colleagues, friends, family members. Feel free to take these, and we have people come from all over the world to train with us. And you get to do a lot of this work and learn how to use it in your lives and your work and your leadership. So I brought those as well. And I just want to say I've been coming to High Holiday Services since 1991. And on Shabbat morning when I'm in town, I come, and I know some members of the Kehila come. And so you are very much a sister community for me. So it was a great joy to get to work with you this morning. So thank you.